Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast, how to gain access to the bonus content. Also, there are both audio and video versions of this show, and you can find them on various platforms. In most cases, the video version has some maps, images, sometimes video clips, things that enhance the content, so you may want to check that out if you're interested. We have a special guest today, Jeffrey Kaye. We talk about his research and writing on the Korean War and the biological warfare that was waged. His work is based on years of experience and research, including in-depth research on the depositions by prisoners of war and other materials, some that required laborious and expensive efforts to obtain. And in a bonus segment, we talk about how the U.S. biowarfare operations have changed since the offensive bioweapons programs were officially ended during the Nixon administration, when the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention was ratified. Jeffrey Kaye is a retired psychologist. For nearly 10 years, he worked part-time with Survivors International in San Francisco, conducting both assessment and psychotherapy of torture victims. After 9/11, he joined others in protesting the activities of psychologists in the CIA and Department of Defense, some of whom helped develop interrogation programs that have been widely exposed, and that includes torture, other forms of cruel treatment of prisoners. He's also a blogger and an author of the book Cover Up at Guantanamo. His articles have been published for many years on various media outlets, including Counterpunch, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera. Dr. Jeffrey Kaye is here, speaking to us from Hawaii, which I'm very jealous of, by the way. Jeff, it's great to see you. Thanks for saying so much. It's been a long time since we've talked, and it's great to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've been on your show before, but yeah, it's thank you so much for asking me on.
Yeah, so you have a heck of a piece of work that you've done this time, and I'm really, I don't want to say excited, but I'm really glad that we're getting the opportunity to talk about this. It's not a fun topic, right? It couldn't have been easy to do this
It's a
research.
very dark topic. No, it's not. You have to, it's like you dive in and then you've got to pull back for your sanity and mental health.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty dark. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about two different articles that were published very recently and in the past few months. And the first one is on Medium. And of course, as always, the links to all of these will be in the show notes for you. The first one is on Medium, and it's titled Secret History, U.S. Air Force, Marine Corps, Flyers, Confessions on the Use of Biological Weapons in the Korean War. And the other one is more recently published in Counterpunch, and it's titled CIA, the MK Ultra, and the Cover-Up of U.S. Germ Warfare in the Korean War. Now, Jeff, first of all, how did you get into this project? How did these articles come about?
Yeah, it's a good question because my career had been as a clinical psychologist. And in the early 2000s, a friend of mine who was in charge of a torture treatment center in San Francisco, now kind of out of business, Survivors International, had recruited me to work part-time on a pro bono kind of basis to work with torture survivors. These were essentially asylum refugees, applicants for asylum, political asylum in the United States, some of whom needed documentation of their torture in their home countries, so that the well-founded fear of persecution, which is the criteria for asylum, could be proved in court. So I started to work with torture victims, a lot of them, dozens of them over the years, some of them in psychotherapy, many of them just in-depth evaluations, hearing their stories of the torture, et cetera. And that involved continuing education courses, readings, discussions, case conferences with other people also working with torture victims. And then lo and behold, the United States during the Bush Jr. administration famously became known for enhanced interrogation techniques. And then it became known in the press, New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, that psychologists had been instrumental in putting together this torture program for the CIA. So I and a number of other people were outraged at this. We were trying to do things within the American Psychological Association. And so I became interested in looking up some of the information. So just one, in the articles from the New York Times, it mentioned that the CIA's enhanced interrogation program was based upon Chinese, meaning Red Chinese techniques of torture, interrogation to produce false confessions during the Korean War. And by that they meant, what were the false confessions? They were false confessions of American use of biological weapons during that war, bombings of both North Korea and China. So I thought, wow, that would be very interesting. I believed it. I wrote, if you go back, you can find blog posts in which I echo, because I trusted what they were saying. I echoed that very theme, that these techniques came from Chinese torture and to produce false confessions. I said, well, I would like to just see the false confessions. I thought that would be very interesting. I could compare it with what people were telling me in psychotherapy. I thought it would be, from a psychologist standpoint, it would be a rich source of detail. And I thought it would be helpful even in understanding the torture program. But lo and behold, it was impossible to get a copy. I could not find the confession, the confessions. It was as if they didn't exist, which was very strange. There were primary documents, and there were many news stories at the time. It was a very famous thing. Every history book on the Korean War, you'll read about the warfare, biological warfare confessions, etc. So why can't we read them? It didn't make any sense. So shortcut, just to say, ultimately I did find these things, but it took a long time, and the bulk of them had to come from outside of the United States. It came from Great Britain, actually. And but still, while I wrote about them and talked about them, unfortunately, the agreement I made with the library in Great Britain was that I could not publish, that was for my use only. I could not reproduce the copy they gave me. And since I don't want to either, one, go to jail, which I doubt would happen, but two, lose my connection to archivists and librarians for whom I might have later need, I honored what they told me. Nevertheless, as I say in my Medium article, I realized at a certain point that fair use doctrine would be such that I could print some of this material, a good portion of it, because what these confessions showed me when I read them is they weren't I thought I was going to see crazy allegations, and instead I found very heartfelt statements about disgust at the use of biological warfare. I found very detailed statements about who ordered it, how the orders were passed on, where they got how the logistics of setting up the weaponry was done, what it was like for the lower level officers, the navigators, and what it was like at the commanding levels, because some of there were a handful of colonels who were captured and had knowledge of what was going on all the way up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this was rich material historically, and yet when I approached historians on it, they weren't interested. They said, you don't want to talk about this. One even told me, no one ever made their career out of investigating this kind of thing. And I thought to myself, well, that's good, because I'm retired now. I'm a retired psychologist. And by the time I had the time to do this, and I'm not looking for a career in history. I'm just looking for the truth.
Clearly, they didn't know you very well. They didn't know you very well if they said that. Yeah. Because I do remember, I think I've been following you since you began doing that work on the torture program. I can't believe it's been that long, but I think it has.
Yeah, I think I started writing in 2006, 2007.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there, yeah. And I picked up the Korean War stuff really in a big way only about 5-6 years ago, I'd say. when I retired and had more time to look, I'd had this material, and I had sought another document that was unavailable in the United States that was very important. It was the report of the International Scientific Commission to investigate bacterial warfare against China and Korea. It had been the World Peace Council had, at China's urging, had put together this investigatory team that went to North Korea and China in the summer of 1952 to look into the charges. And it was headed by a very famous and very respected British scientist, Joseph Needham, later became a historian of science and was given awards by the Queen, etc., in Great Britain. And they put out a massive report documenting, they talked to hundreds of witnesses, looked at the scientific medical evidence that the Chinese and North Korean doctors and lab technicians and bacteriologists had gathered, and said, yeah, this was, and they looked at other evidence as well. And they even did, despite what some people say, some of their own testing to look to the degree they could into the possibilities of whether or not these reports had been falsified, et cetera. And they made some corrections to earlier reports. Anyway, it's a very important report. And I luckily was able to, at my own expense, find a copy of that, again, outside of the United States, bought it, had it professionally digitized, and then had it posted online at a very successful article at medium.com under Insurge Intelligence. Published it at medium.com rather than myself. And people can now read that whole document. It includes some of the confession of the airmen's confessions are also in that document.
Yeah, I'll have to get a link to that and put that in the show notes as well.
Okay.
So you've been working on this for about 5 years. Yeah,
Right.
I'll just make sure I have the right one.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been working on this for about 5 years, this work?
At least in a concerted way. I had looked into it. I think my search for the Airman's Confessions, goes back really to 2006, 2007, when I was reading those New York Times reports, and just kind of casually kept, my eye out for it. I wasn't hunting real hard. I was working, and I had clinical work to do. It's very taxing. Yeah. You mentioned, I haven't seen any other interviews on this yet, but I did see one video report with clips from you in there. You mentioned something about a 60-year anniversary and some documents being released because of a 60-year. Well, right. In 2010, the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War, at least as formally understood.
Okay.
The CIA did a release of documents that they had previously been classified from the Korean War, and some old articles from studies in intelligence. And, they were looking a lot at the origins of the Korean War and had there been intelligence failures, and there were. But what interested me is they released a hefty amount of communications intelligence reports. These were CIA reports that were, sent. Analysts had looked at these raw data. The raw data was from the armed forces, the forerunner to the NSA, the armed forces. I'm sorry, I can't remember the full name.
I don't actually know the name of it either.
It was the Army's Signals Intelligence Organization in Korea, and they're secretly they had broken the code and they were secretly listening in to military communications of the North Koreans and the Chinese, and then they would send these raw data intercepts to like the CIA and other, I presume, other agencies that like to listen in to get the intelligence. And anyway, the CIA would write up a analyst report on the daily stuff, and they published a lot of them online, and they called the release "Baptism by Fire," and that's what they called it. And they had a panel on C-SPAN talking about it. None of it relevant. They never mentioned the biological warfare aspect. It was never mentioned. And I thought, Well, I think I just stumbled across this, just surfing around online, start Googling CIA biological warfare. There it is. And I discovered there was a whole bunch of these. And another, by the way, researcher and author who's very well known, much better known than I am, Nicholson Baker, was apparently doing much the same thing, looking around and hunting around. He recently wrote a book called Baseless. The full name is, but it was about his 4-year researches on the biological warfare question in general, and just how degraded the FOIA process has become, how frustrating and degraded. But he did get a lot of information. The book is essential read, and he did look at the biological warfare, and he stumbled also across some of these articles. I ended up looking at them once I realized they existed. They were top secret documents. Above top secret, actually. Only certain people could look at them. They had code names like Suede, and most of them, the period I'm looking at, they were called the Suede documents, like suede shoes. And I read them through and did searches, and I was amazed that I found about 24 or so documents that were in which the CIA analysts gave lengthy quotes to the raw data transcripts from these communications intelligence intercepts that had been that cryptanalysts had to decipher and then translate. And what they were saying is, hey, we're being bombed by biological weapons. We're having insects drop on us. We need DDT. Please send it here as quickly as you can. There's a situation happening over here that we can't get food supplies through. We're going to have starvation in the ranks if something doesn't change right away. This is because of the biological warfare. Wow, I thought I had found, and I still believe I did, the smoking gun. This was not, because there had been 2 Canadian scholars back in the late 1990s, Stephen Endicott and Edward Hagerman, who published a book through University of Indiana Press called The U.S. and Biological Warfare, Secrets from the Cold War in Korea. And they had gone to China, and the Chinese had declassified it from their own standpoint, some of their own documents, and allowed them into archives. And they found and published some of the materials that they found about, how China was reacting and what they were seeing from the military standpoint on the biological warfare. But in the United States, if the source is China, it has no standing. It didn't, people, that's just communist propaganda. It must be a hoax. It must be. But here's the CIA's own documents, from live, contemporaneous, on the spot intercepts of military communications from the enemy, detailing over and over and over again over a period of months attacks with biological weapons. So, that should be it. But we live in America, and that was the beginning of a journey. I thought my journey looking at the lies around torture was bad. This turned out to be far, far worse, because what you had was a massive operation that was covered up, and the details of the cover up, even to this day, continue to astound me. I find in the past year, and one of the links I know I gave you, I think, I believe I did, was shocked to find that that the U.S. had a program of interdiction of all mail from behind the Iron Curtain, from communist countries beginning in 1951 that lasted to 1965. And then I researched it some, and I found that there were congressional hearings about this, and they were destroying hundreds of thousands of pieces of mail a month.
On the name of stopping propaganda.
What they said, propaganda, and really news or alternate viewpoints, whatever you want to call it, from coming in. That's why you couldn't find the ISC Needham report. That's why I couldn't find the books that China had published in English about the confessions, because they were intercepted and destroyed in the United States. The way I found that out was a scientist I was talking to. I'm not going to use his name because he didn't give me the right to, and but who told me in passing in an email one day, talking about the biological warfare and this and that. And he didn't think, by the way, there had been biological warfare. But anyway, But he said in passing, well, Jeff, our archives really aren't that good because so much was destroyed in those years. And I thought to myself, I didn't know that. Let me start looking in. And then I started to find articles about it And anyway, people can read about that if they wish. But that's just an example of it's kind of like Plato's cave, where we've been looking at the shadows and we're not really looking at the reality. People talk about the Kennedy assassination. I think there's a new Oliver Stone documentary out, or they talk about I know you had a great show. I was listening to it on Amerithrax recently, and the kinds of things. This, nothing surprises me anymore. If you can cover this up, the question is, well, how could you cover it up? And the answer is you can't totally cover it up. The information, as the famous show on TV used to say, is out there. Well, the X-Files.
Oh, right.
The information is out there, but who wants to publish it? Who wants to spend time on it? Who wants to read it?
And back in the day, who would publish it?
Right. And even still, great difficulty. I have to thank Counterpunch, because I did go to other sites, including sites that were left-wing and alternative sites, great sites, really. I don't want to give their names, and no interest. So it's difficult, and it's the main difficulty is this concerns North Korea and now, of course, China, both of whom are vilified, both of whom very well we could be at war with very soon.
Yeah. And
war, in the consequences of such a war would be catastrophic to you, to me, to everybody. And that's really what partly motivated me to continue on with this. When I realized that this level of lying and historical subterfuge had taken place, then it would be morally wrong for me to turn away from it. And if I find details that don't fit my theories, I report those too. But unfortunately, it's been as bad as, or worse than really worse than I anticipated when I entered into this field.
And that's as I was reading through what makes these articles even more valuable is that you offer some analysis, and overall, you've curated, you've decided, and you put comments in there as to like what you thought was credible, why, and having, knowing your background and your current work, I trust that analysis. I think you're almost uniquely, I think you're uniquely qualified. I'm not just fluffing, you really are uniquely qualified to make that kind of judgment. I couldn't tell. And I think that in this kind of situation, I don't think we can make broad strokes and say you can't believe anything from here or from there or from this person or that. You can't.
Yeah.
So, I appreciated that. And it's kind of surprising, the conclusions that you came to. But before we dig into that a little more, let's do just a little. I assume that anybody watching this is gonna, if you're not familiar with the Korean War, and I'm certainly no expert on it, but you'll maybe dig into some basics. So
right.
You'll have a little background on that. I don't know if you want to do just some real bare bones, or we just dig right into the the article. Into the first article. We have two articles to cover here.
Right.
So,
well, it is important because the Korean War has been called the Forgotten War, and most people don't know anything more except maybe that somehow North Korea invaded South Korea, and the U.S. went to their rescue, and for reasons no one understands, it ended up in kind of a tie. And the war was never really ended per se, just an armistice took place. And then there's this DMZ line, and it's still there, and that's it. That's really what people know. And North Korea is an awful country that does really bizarre and terrible things. And South Korea is a great success story, a democracy.
Yeah.
It has K-pop,
Yeah.
and a lot of TV shows now,
Yeah.
K-dramas.
Yeah.
And that's what we have. But what's relevant, and just I'm going to give you a very small capsule in terms of what's relevant to my topic, which was the initiation and conduct of the biological war campaign, and then the decision to cover it up. But real briefly, after Korea was occupied by Japan for decades prior to World War II. When Japan lost World War II, Korea was occupied, and the peninsula was split between a Soviet zone of occupation in the north and an American zone of occupation in the south. And that line was set up by the Soviets and the Americans at the 38th parallel. They didn't ask the Koreans about it; they just did it. And and then America, the United States, militarily occupied South Korea for a period of about 2 to 3 years. It was a U.S. military government ran South Korea, and they propped up the old ruling class that had worked with the Japanese. And of course, that was a huge mistake because America came to be hated, still is even to this day in many quarters, because the Japanese occupation was terrible. It was awful. Anyway, there were back and forth clashes between the North and the South. I'm really cutting a lot out here, so I hope people who know about the Korean War history don't go, wait, he forgot about that. But anyway, ultimately in June of 1950, in a response to tremendous reprisals against the left in South Korea, and out of a belief that Korea needed to be unified, the North Korean government finally got approval that they would get some backing, military backing, in terms of supplies and money from the Soviet Union, and then people are looking at this right now. A lot of the history still is up in the air, but perhaps we're anticipating an imminent invasion from the South as well. Whatever happened, full-scale war did break out in June of 1950. And the South Korean government was so reviled and hated that the North Korean government just swept through, like going through, like cheese. They just, drove the Koreans and what Americans were there, the South Korean army and what Americans were there, all the way down to a tiny little spot near the city of Busan in the south west corner of Korean Peninsula. And they practically had occupied the war was just about over at that point. And that was in a matter of a few months. But then MacArthur and the Americans counterattacked, kind of a pincer attack from attacking through the rear at Incheon in a very famous invasion, and cut off the rear of the North Korean supply lines, and this sending the Korean troops in kind of a pell-mell retreat. They retreated all the way up practically to their own border with China. At that point, the Chinese entered the war out of concern for their own security and also in support of the North Korean government. And they swept down again, pushing the troops down to below the 38th parallel. There was another, and that was in November of 1950. So all of this was happening within a few months. I mean, it was just rapid back and forth. The city of Seoul was occupied by both sides like 2 or 3 times. So when the China entered the war, though, the American military knew that they didn't just have a small army. I mean, North Korea didn't even have an air force. They didn't just have a small army. They had a major land army in the sense of China entering the war. And, they had lost quite badly. It was really the biggest land defeat that the United States had ever suffered. They were pushed back again from the border, the Yalu River, essentially the border between North Korea and China, all the way down, into deeper into South Korea. And there was a lot of talk about using nuclear weapons at that point. And it almost happened. And nukes were shipped into Asia. And I believe
it's just
they went
a few
to
years
Okinawa.
after they actually used them. So,
Yeah, that's right. They'd already used them. And
less than a decade. Yeah.
either Truman decided not to or cooler heads prevailed, but they thought they had a better weapon, or they might be able to have a better weapon, and that would be biological weapons, which had been researched in depth during World War II. After the World War II ended, it was kind of went on the back burner, and now they had, at this point, started a crash program. That's what they called it themselves, a crash program in biological weapons, and that's what they were intending to use. And there was one other major factor here, and that has to do with the Japanese biological warfare program, which the US appropriated from Japan, Imperial Japan, at the close of World War II, known as Unit 731. I don't know if you're familiar, or your listeners how familiar they are, but it was a major program. The Japanese did a lot of experiments, killed thousands of people, prisoners. It's so horrific. It was at the level, if not surpassing, the kinds of experiments the Nazis did. It was led by a man by the name of General Shiro Ishii. And after the war, the Fort Detrick personnel descended on Japan and wanted to interview the biological warfare people. And they did, and they decided they would give them a full amnesty for their war crimes. And they probably killed a few 100,000 people in their trial runs of biological warfare during the World War II in China, not to mention the thousands they had fatal experiments on. They were trying to figure out how to use biological weapons. And the US did interviews with them, talked with them. Shiro Ishii is reported to have gone back to Fort Detrick to talk to people. And just 6 months before, but the US decided it would all be kept secret. It was all to be kept in intelligence circles. And when the war crimes trials in Japan were taking place in 1946, 47, 48, they made sure that nothing about this, was put on trial or was discussed. The Soviets had been pushing for that to be part of the war crimes trials. When it didn't happen, they put on their own war crimes trial in the city of Khabarovsk in Siberia, just near Manchuria, just north of Manchuria, near North Korea, and then they published in English. This was before they put this program in place, barring all literature coming from the Soviet Union, et cetera. And so there's still a number of copies you can buy, and they exist. And now it's digitized. You can read it for free at Google Books. Anyway.
Can I just ask real quick?
Yes.
So they got the Japanese biowarfare experts,
Yes.
brought them over, gave them amnesty, got the knowledge out of them. Sounds, very much like what they did with the Nazi scientists.
Yes, absolutely.
From Germany.
Yes.
I don't know what kind of biowarfare they may have been. I knew they were doing experimentation, but
Japanese?
The Germans, I'm not familiar with any.
The Germans weren't doing too much, but they were looking at plague. They were looking at botulism, I believe, their cholera. They were looking at some things, but they never really got going a big mainstream program. Partly, apparently, because Hitler wasn't so thrilled with it, and some of the other top Nazis. Germany had a terrible experience with chemical warfare in World War I, and that just, even though I know it seems contradictory, bizarre that the Nazis would actually blanch at some kind of terror, they did.
Yeah.
But Japan, that wasn't the case. They went much farther, and their style of, besides using biological weapons, is sabotage and dumping, cholera germs in lakes and things like this. Ishii and his men had worked assiduously on creating germ bombs and using particularly insect vectors, meaning insects, to deliver. You drop a bunch of fleas that you've inoculated with bubonic plague, and you drop it in an area, and you count on the fleas to spread the plague. And in fact, they did that in China, and it did spread plague. And they were working on other things such as anthrax, et cetera. So that's the kind of biological warfare.
50, that's 70 years ago.
Yes.
Here's what really terrifies me. Is, how has it advanced since then, 70 years ago? Anyway.
Well, they worked a lot on biological warfare over the decades, and until Nixon supposedly stopped all offensive use of offensive biological warfare research and ended dissembled the U.S. arsenal of biological warfare.
I'll save that bit for the bonus question, because I do want to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's do some on the confessions that you went through, the various depositions, and then I want to make sure to leave enough time for the Counterpunch article as well. But there's a lot of very interesting stuff, and I just want to remind everybody of what Jeff's background, current experience, and everything that we talked about, and why that makes the analysis of these, the curation and the analysis of these statements so important, I think. Do you want to pick out a few that we zero in on, or like I've got some bits that I've highlighted here. I don't know if you want to sort of want me to pull them out, or if you want to skim them. I'm not sure how to cover this.
I'd be curious to know what caught your eye, because you may be.
Let's see. Okay, so here's the first one I put an extra note on. Let me go back. I'll just read the beginning of this paragraph. You have, from my examination, the confessions as a whole present a rational and believable narrative. Well, actually, we should do a little bit of background, right? So the background on this is that these are prisoners of war. They gave statements that were public statements. Well, there's a mix of them. And then when they came back, many of them retracted these statements, and then that became the story. And so you've gone through all of these confessions, and this one paragraph is, from my examination, the confessions, quote unquote, as a whole represent a rational and believable narrative, one unlikely to have been concocted by foreign interrogators. So tell me why. What was some of your reasoning that went into this analysis?
Right. Well, in the article, I point out at various times some of the kinds of things. But basically, I sat down and originally I was going to write an article like this, by the way, which I was going to say, this confessor, this officer stated A, B, C, D, E. He knew this officer. This guy said this, and I was going to go through and document how everything they said, that I had plenty of open source corroboration for the details they were giving. And I mentioned some of it in the article, but you could give a lot more.
Yeah.
I was thoroughly convinced that these were not, if you read the retractions of and the articles in the press, some of which I linked to in in both articles, you would think these were fanciful creations, things, people saying whatever they could off the top of their heads to make the people happy. But the stories were consistent, and they were also. So, for instance, if you had lower level officers, they would talk about what they knew. This is how a bomb looked when it was loaded in a bay. This is what the fuse on the bomb looked like. This is what we were told when we dropped them, to report back that they were duds. That way, it was our way of covering up the biological warfare. That's what a lieutenant might say. But if you're a colonel, well, now you're saying such and such an officer who was a commanding officer, called a meeting of other, high-level officers and told us about the germ warfare, and this is what we're doing. And in May of this year, we're going to begin a new stage. They knew it at the higher strategic level. So these you would have to assume that. So that was one reason. They were consistent in terms of what they were being given. They made statements. Sometimes there's just little tells, like one of the most famous of all the confessions was by a man by the name of Frank Schwabel. He was a Marine Corps colonel. He was the highest ranking Marine Corps prisoner in the Korean War. He was the um, chief of staff or whatever of a whole Marine wing in the war, and he says in his confession at one point, these weapons are damnable. He says they're not even Marine weapons. That's not something that a Chinese interrogator would tell him to put in. That was something that a Marine might say about the Air Force shoving down their throats these kind of weapons, this kind of weaponry. So these are the kind of things. So the things they talked about, to the degree I could find them, were you could corroborate. And the things I couldn't find even then also made sense. So for instance, there were many of the flyers would say, we were given briefings by somebody on the germ warfare, and Mr. Wilson came to give us a civilian came and gave us or Captain so-and-so. These were, and I could never find who these people were, because of course these intelligence people would never give their real names, right? That's what makes sense. So that's why their names aren't there. But there were other reasons that I did believe them. And that was, again, if you read the confessions as a whole, there's a certain sincerity and a tone that is consistent, but not entirely consistent. So for instance, there are people who are very terse in their so-called confession, or depositions is what the Chinese call them. They're depositions about the use of germ warfare. And others of them were very impassioned in how they felt cheated by the United States and what the United States was doing. And a few of them even adopted kind of, this is what US imperialism does. Well, if these were all just confessions that were being concocted, they all would be saying US imperialism. Now, another thing that struck me was in their propaganda, meaning their statement, I mean that in a generalized sense, but in their statements that were produced for the world about the biological warfare attack, both the Koreans and the Chinese made certain that people knew that the United States was allying itself with the former Japanese biological warfare people, who were criminals that should have been brought to justice. Here's their names, here's who they were. They worked at Fort Detrick. They made it quite clear. So if this is what they wanted to say, you would think that that's what would be in the confessions, but it's not. There are roughly 25 written confessions that are available to us out of about 3 dozen or so, according to U.S. researchers.
Still missing, right? Those other ones?
The other ones are missed. They were never published. Whether they were missing, in that sense, I don't know why they weren't. We'd have to ask China, and they're not telling me. But only 2 of Japan is barely mentioned. There's a couple of the statements, literally just a handful that mention it in passing very briefly. Where the airman says something about, they told us in a meeting, this is that Japan was involved, but none of the ones I published in this article, the Medium article, which were all high-ranking officers, none of them mentioned it.
The only things I saw in your article was that the actual agents were being made near Tokyo, in Tokyo.
Right. Well, yes,
but
right. They talked about.
They don't. This is.
But that's under the American occupation.
Yeah, this is under occupation. So.
Right. And they didn't say, well, of course they would, because that's where the Unit 731 personnel were.
Right. That was even more opportunity to get into that.
If Japan wanted to push that, then they would have, but they didn't. And it's an example of how.
Did they know that? Did they know that part?
No, that's a good question.
You don't know?
I don't know. The only person who might have known it, I think, and this comes up, and this is a very new finding, kind of blew me away.
I think I know who you're going to say.
Walker Mahurin.
The one who wrote the book.
Honest John.
Yeah.
That's what, Honest John.
Yeah.
But Walker Mahurin was a colonel, high-ranking man who was, again, worked at the Pentagon. He had visited Fort Detrick and toured the biological warfare facilities. I read his autobiography, and I had to read it like 3 times before it finally struck me. This is how some things just get buried. When he says in passing, this is in the new Counterpunch article, he says in his autobiography how before he went to war in Korea, a good friend of his who happened to be in the Central Intelligence Agency by the name of Joseph Bryan invited him to go to this intelligence affair on an aircraft carrier. It's just said in passing, Joseph Bryan. I'm not going to think, So I when I first read it, I didn't think anything of it, although it should have already set me off to know, well, why is he a friend with the CIA guy? And then even secondarily, why is he outing this guy as CIA? Because at the time he's writing, he was still a well-known figure. Well, I looked up who Joseph Bryan was. It took me a while, and I wish I had known. I discovered afterwards another researcher out there who's, I mentioned in the article, who's researches on, done some books on UFOs, et cetera. Because this guy, Joseph Bryan, it turned out, had been on the, what's it called? The National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which was kind of the Pentagon, CIA kind of setup on UFOs.
One of those, yeah.
He was on it. He was a high-ranking Air Force officer, and he supposedly believed in UFOs. But I never looked deep into the UFO story. I don't really care that much at the moment compared to this. But
there have been several iterations of.
He discovered, and then I independently discovered, that this guy, Joseph Bryan, was the chief of the Office of Policy Coordination, which was the CIA's covert war branch during the Korean War period. He was their chief of political and psychological warfare.
That
he
was
wasn't
his
just
friend?
nobody. That was his friend, yes. And that was his friend. And he
just
I discovered
invited him to an aircraft carrier, a meeting on an aircraft carrier.
With other intelligence officials, yes. This is before he went to Korea. And he was shot down in Korea, and he wrote a very damning confession. And he worried, I could get into that story, but he worried a lot about what would happen to him.
And other people said that he gave up a lot of really important information, right? Classified information.
Well, that was more Schwabel, because people didn't, going back to Frank Schwabel, there were the 2 high-ranking colonels, Colonel Schwabel from the Marine Corps, Colonel Mahurin from the Air Force. Both of them gave up a lot of information.
Yeah.
And, so that was, and the other reason, of course, is Mahurin was made the spokesperson for all the other POW confessors. And they had to, if you wanted to speak to someone, you had to go through him. Of course, he's the guy with the CIA links. Coincidence? Maybe not. But it's just something, it's just another aspect of this whole story that's opened up. But really, the CIA is all over this, everywhere. The CIA during the Korean War period, there was a battle between, the CIA was set up in 1947 out of the leftovers of the OSS.
Right.
And as the Truman administration was turning in a big way to the Cold War and the national security, development of the National Security Council and the CIA. And then they had this weird odd duck thing called the Office of Policy Coordination, which really was in the CIA, but for some strange reason answered to the State Department and the Defense Department in terms of hierarchy of authority. But yet they were in the CIA. That was that messy situation only lasted a few years, but it happened to be the years of the Korean War for the most part. But the CIA, was the agency in charge of covert warfare. They battled with the Joint Chiefs of Staff over whether or not they would have the authority, or the Joint Chiefs would, in areas where combat was taking place, like Korea. And in the end, the CIA won out. The Joint Chiefs of Staff just discovered that they were supposed to be kept in the loop.
There's a lot of stuff about that in the book, The Brothers. A lot of that that tug of war on covert warfare.
Right.
Yeah, I think battle's still going on today, but
oh yeah, absolutely.
That tug of war. Anyway, I don't want to get us off topic though.
Well, no, the intersection between them is, once a a member of the intelligence community who I had been talking to told me, he says, Jeff, because I was going, yeah, well, the CIA, this is about Guantanamo. Well, the CIA, and then you had the Department of Defense and the DIA. He goes, Jeff, it's all one government. They may have their tiffs and their battles over turf, but in the end, they all work together. Mm. And that's really kind of what it was with the biological warfare. In fact, my newest article, if you haven't read it yet, has a shocking revelation in which, as early as 1948, the CIA was briefing top biological warfare officials who were lobbying the Department of Defense for a major biological warfare program, and they were briefing them about MK Ultra style interrogations of using drugs and hypnotism and experimental drugs and highballs and not highballs, what do they call speedballs, right? They'd shoot people up with barbiturates, and then they'd give them methamphetamine, and then they would try and hypnotize them in an effort to control, to break down their personalities and control their mind, all while under isolation and, use of threats, etc. And they called that was known as first Bluebird and then Artichoke programs, the forerunners to MK Ultra. And this was all, they were all working with the biological warfare people. They was all together. They served on each other's boards. Nicholson Baker, it's very shocking and bizarre.
Yeah, it's just, you have to like hold yourself back when you talk about this stuff. It enrages me, but.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. All in the name of anti-communism. The U.S., another thing to keep in mind is during the Korean War, of course, the United States still saw their major enemy as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, China didn't, and North Korea that certainly didn't then. And, they thought that North Korea, for instance, was just a monkey's paw for the Soviets, that they were controlling every move, and which wasn't really the case. And the biological warfare initially was thought to be, they were going to use it against the Soviet Union.
So the reasoning, all throughout these things, there are bits about when it started, a lot of dates, who was involved and all that. But then many times they talk about the reasons for it, why they did it, what were the goals, and things like that. And I saw two main things in there. One was to try it out. It was a testing ground for using biological weapons. And then, but they did seem to have a tactical goal for this particular war here, which was the supply lines, to interrupt the supply lines. But it looked to me, and I could be wrong, that really, maybe the way they got some kind of an approval to do this was to just test it out, small scale, different kinds of biological weapons, different, what do you call it? Different methods, bombs, spray, different, also tactics, right? How high should they fly, from what, where should they place them, highways to affect the moving troops, facilities to affect try to contaminate the supplies themselves. So they were testing out tactics and things like that, but I don't know.
They call that field trials.
Okay, field trials, yeah.
Real world field trial.
Yeah, with right. There have been some wars that I've wondered whether they were field trials, more recent, or a way to show off weapons to be bought by other, in the modern times.
Yeah.
So anyway, to me,
they'll say that,
yeah. But to me, it looked like that it really was more of a field trial than something that needed to be done, even though it was a struggle, right? And they were probably embarrassed. This was a glorified military of, just 5 years after World War II. I mean, they're still glorified, so you can imagine how much they were then. So did you come across, is that an accurate take from it? What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, when did they
Yeah.
start? What's the time frame that they did this? And what do you think the reasoning was, or what do you think was accomplished?
Well, it looks to me that although I don't feel as strongly about this as I do about the 1952 December 1951, January 1952 is when the air war began with the use of using planes to deliver biological weapons. Prior to that, it apparently there was they were using it biological weapons as sabotage. In other words, they would poison wells, for instance. Korea is still was fairly rural country, and you needed water, you'd go to the communal well, and the idea is you would poison that well with some kind of poison or toxin or disease-carrying substance. And in fact, when the North Koreans captured Seoul in the summer of 1950, they found documents saying this is what we're going to do. It was Plan A and Plan B, and Plan A was poison the wells, and use biological weapons. And then there was a smallpox epidemic that took place as well. And the North Koreans and the Chinese were very adamant that the Americans had spread smallpox. And there was a very strange occurrence in which a high-level American raided North Korea, did supposedly Crawford Sams, who ran the medical department, or medical experiments or whatever. They had a ship that it was an epidemic ship, and then he had gone in to kidnap hospitalized patients in North Korea to see what they had disease with. It was kind of medical surveillance intelligence raid. The full story behind all of that and everything that happened in the first year of the war is difficult. I don't know. Again, I don't have the communications intelligence records and the kind of documentation we have for the later stage of the war. But at some point, they decided that they were going, and I think the reason was, again, the military losses on the battlefield meant they had to step it up. It wasn't enough to just use for sabotage. And in my articles, I do describe at various points, where there were discussions in the late 1940s, for instance, about use of biological weapons for sabotage purposes, the use of insects as for that purpose as well. But by they needed some kind of ad hoc weaponry. They were working very hard on their crash program for biological weapons, and it just wasn't going as fast as they liked it to have gone. There was again some feuds and lack of coordination between the Air Force and the Army Chemical Corps in terms of exactly what criteria would be used. It's still somewhat unclear to me because the records just aren't available, just how much that mattered. But it does seem that the decision to and some of the confessions go into this. They'll say, and by December of 1951, it was a go. Or in September of 1951, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the advisory agency said, "We've got to go forward with this. We need it," and the people, the high-ranking officers in the confessions, Mahurin, Schwabel, Blay, state that the decision came down. They say it came from the Joint Chiefs, and I believe it. To move to, there was no way that they could use that level of military equipment and planes, for instance, and logistics, and use it in battlefield scenarios where they were supporting, the troop movements of the Americans and their allies in the Korean War without it going through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's no way. So in that sense, I see the biological warfare program as being largely more a Pentagon thing than the CIA. The CIA played a very important role in certain aspects, I believe, but in the end, it was a Pentagon-run program for the most part. Although I believe that by 1953, the U.S. was using something CIA aircraft that were assigned to it that they were kind of getting from the Air Force. And it takes us into a side aspect that I'm not going to go into right now. But it was a Pentagon deal. But a lot of this stuff, I don't know the answers because they're not open. It's a work in progress.
Yeah, exactly.
I do know, though, that it happened now. I wasn't sure. So finally, your question about the confessions. Until I saw the communications intelligence documents, which I came across actually about 5 years ago. I wanted to publish something on it then, but to be honest with you, I was very sick. I had cancer, and I just did not have the energy and the time and the wherewithal to do the necessary amount of work. So it just got put off for a period of years. But I knew, because I saw those and I said, well, these attacks really happened. And that throws another whole light on the confessions. If you believe the confessions were the results of of torture, and the confessions were false, then you think one way. If you know that this event really happened, and now the confessions don't look false, you can look at parts of them that appear dubious and parts of them that seem right on. And by the way,
or a mixture, right?
Or it could be a mixture. They are a mixture, I believe. Although, and one thing that I was swimming against was my own belief at the time that I had swallowed, even though I was uncomfortable with it, which I'll explain why, which was that torture produces false confessions.
Yeah.
Of course, if you were being tortured or I was being tortured, we didn't know the answer to what the information they wanted. Either of us might very well just tell them whatever they wanted to hear.
Right.
And they would have a false confession. But let's say I really did have the information that you wanted to know. Let's say I did have, the very first person I ever worked with who was tortured was someone from a Central American country who came to see me consumed with guilt because, in fact, they had given up the names of their comrades under torture.
Yeah.
Now, it would be, I have always believed it was disrespectful to the many people who, in fact, have given information under torture, and there have been many, to say that torture only produces false confessions. It doesn't. It does, but what it does do, of course, is it muddies the water. How do you know that they're not just saying it because they're being forced to say something? But the point still is, what they do, you've seen it in a million World War II movies. They get the information from the torture victim, and they turns to the assistant and says, go check these people out. Bring them in and we'll interrogate them.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a very sad and dark subject, but
it is, and nothing's cut and dry, like you said, because the person who has the information to give probably going to give it. Who can withstand torture? But it's the person who doesn't have the information, who keeps getting tortured, who's going to come up with something. So, I agree with you. And I'll be careful in statements that I make going forward too, to say that the only thing that torture I think is accurate is to say it produces unreliable information, right?
Right. You can't count on the information you get. Yeah. Right. And
it doesn't mean that the information itself is unreliable. It means that you, I don't know how to put it. Yeah, you can't know for sure.
And in any case, even if you could prove that it was reliable, and even if you could prove that torture was a very efficacious method of producing information, one would still oppose it on humanitarian grounds and on larger, as I mentioned in the article, you have a discussion of this, on a larger kind of, if you will, strategic or societal grounds, because the effects of torture go way beyond just the interrogation session. And those need to be taken into account for any entity that thinks that they can torture.
And there's a real ironic story by putting it's embedded in the Medium story, but it's, across the two stories. The irony of using the excuse, saying, okay, these prisoners of war were tortured and they told about this biological warfare program, and it was just a lie that was tortured out of them, and so on. But when they got home, when they got released, what happened to them, Jeff?
Well, they were interrogated, many of them for weeks or months, They were threatened on the ship home that anything they said essentially would be used against them, that they were given aid to the enemy, and they might be prosecuted for torture. Excuse me, for treason. Treason. And all of them were told this. And of course, what did they do? They recanted their confessions. And those recantations held for, till their dying days, with at least one exception. And that exception was a man by the name of Kenneth Enoch, who was interviewed by Tim Tate, a British journalist and author, in a documentary Al Jazeera did 11 years ago now, called Dirty Little Lies, I think. And people could look that up online, but he said he was not mistreated, and he was one of the confessors. And of course, he was also one of the recanters. We only have a half a dozen written recantations. The others, some of them recanted on videos. I have not seen them. They're perhaps in the National Archives somewhere. I don't know, so in terms of documents we look at, there's only a handful really that one can look at. And I posted the links to that, and people, again, part of what I do is if there's alternate information, I let people know where they can look that up.
Yeah, it's a living research project.
Yes, it is.
But in one case, the person describes being followed. I think you mentioned more than one of the returned prisoners of war were followed by the FBI. In other cases, they were, I don't know. It seemed a little like torture to me.
Yes. Yes.
So that's the great irony.
Well, we would want to wonder, I do know, according to historian, let's see, it was Halliday, I've read that the FBI had surveilled these people pretty much for the rest of their lives. I'd like to get the documents on that. I'm going to have to FOIA the FBI. I don't know how much it's going to cost or how long it's going to take. But we do know that strange things happened. It was bad enough that they were threatened with treason. They were threatened with, but in the new article, there may have been worse, and that may be that there was a top secret program known as Project Repair that took place at the Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And Project Repair was a top secret program that was in which they worked on the Air Force prisoners of war, particularly those who had confessed to biological warfare. And they studied them, they interviewed them, they interrogated them. And the man in charge of it, again, by an Air Force officer by the name of James Monroe, turns out to have been with the CIA. In fact, he became the supervisor of the CIA's brainwashing subproject, MK Ultra Subproject 68, which was by Ewan Cameron, the so-called the psychic driving or depatterning brainwashing experiments he did at Allen Memorial Hospital at McGill University in the 1950s, where they took people who came to, and I discussed one of these in the article, who might show up at the hospital, I've got major depression, and so they put you into a coma, and they feed you drugs, and they give you electric shock treatments many times a day. They feed you maybe LSD, other drugs, and then they play tapes in your head while you're unconscious, saying, telling you. There's documentaries on this. It's pretty horrendous. Naomi, what's her name? In the shock treatment, or whatever her book was. Naomi Klein wrote about the Cameron experiments, and many other people have too. They're horrific. They're about as horrible as it gets. It's a nightmare, and the people's lives were destroyed. Their memories were wiped out. And in fact, the Canadian government ended up, they sued, and the Canadian government settled for hundreds of thousands. Even the CIA was forced to cough up some money to these Canadian victims of the MK Ultra program. But the man in charge of that, through a CIA funding cutout known as the Society for Human Ecology, was James Monroe. And at the same time, James Monroe.
Ecology? What's this?
Yes, that's what they called it.
All right.
I know, pretty bizarre. The word ecology enters our lexicon through the CIA, at least on some level, in a
Yeah.
popular way. These things were all exposed in the 1970s, where the kinds of things I read about now were headlines instead of just something that only a couple of podcasters and
Yeah, there's
websites
that
might
weird
venture to
period of
write
time
about.
in the 70s, that Twilight Zone period, when people told the truth for a while and
Right,
exposed
right.
things for a while, but then boom, that was over pretty quickly. But anyway.
Yeah, I know, but it's there. They can't undo that.
Yeah.
And so what did they do? So one of the things that I wanted to pull this out as a separate article, and I probably still will, that when the first prisoners were to be released from Korea and China and sent back in the spring of 1953, the CIA decided that they would run these kind of brainwashing experiments on them. They would drug them, they would hypnotize them, they would, who knows do what, give them the artichoke treatment, and they would at a place at an army hospital in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and
Oh,
they
that's in
shipped the
my
prisoner.
neighborhood.
Yeah, and you can find this online. Although I'm the first person who really kind of put it all together, but the CIA was going to use experimental drugs as well. And when the story goes, the Surgeon General got wind of the experimental drugs, thought it wasn't quite right, didn't apparently protest to the other stuff, but and then there was a lot of leaks. The prisoners' families were very upset because, they were happy they're coming home, and now they're being sent
Yeah.
in barred windowed aircraft with men surrounding them at the airport with Tommy guns, like they were the high, like Guantanamo, like these were high level prisoners and traitors. And bizarrely, even within the government, when I looked at the documents, there was a lot of lying about what was going on to each other. This department lying to that department, who these people were, how bad were they really? Were they, communist saboteurs? Anyway, they weren't. And it got called off, at least initially, but then I found other documents that showed that not only did the US go back, did the CIA go back and do their experiments on these Valley Forge hospital prisoners or patients at that point, but they also were doing experiments on North Korean and Chinese POWs in Korea, doing these same kind of torture experiments. That was all first revealed by John Marks in his famous book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. So that wasn't my discovery, but
Yeah.
I found corroborating information, I suppose.
Yeah, that was a curious bit of you. That made me want to look into that more, that bit in the article, because I don't know that much about that whole story. So
yeah. Oh, well, yeah. It's
let's just mention real quick which diseases that they were working with, which germs,
right.
if you will.
Well, if you depends who
Cholera,
you believe.
yellow fever, typhus. Then there's another list in here somewhere of, I think, what they intended to use. But do we know what they actually did use against the Koreans?
The International Scientific Commission report, I think, is what I go by, because it's hard to say. If you believe the Americans, they were working on a number of the first biological weapon, anti-personnel weapon, they call it, we used on human beings, because they were also biological warfare used against animals and against plants. Right? You would go against the crops, right? You drop cereal rust, to wipe out the rice crop in Korea or China. So, but the first anti-personnel was something called brucellosis, I believe is the name, and it was the Unit 731 people experimented on that as well. And presumably they came up with that bomb in 1954-55 finally, but that was after the Korean War. In the Korean War, it appears that the US used plague germs, just like they were using what Unit 731 used. They used fleas to spread plague. They used other insects to spread anthrax. Cholera was used.
This one mentions
There,
yellow
there were
fever,
others. There's a, I should have written these down.
typhus. I see
Yeah,
typhus, cholera,
typhus,
yellow
right.
fever. But in some of these cases, that's like what the plans were. I
Right. I'm
didn't
not
know
so
what
sure
they
they
actually.
used yellow fever in Korea, although they certainly researched it a great deal. The encephalitis, that was the other one. So these were the kinds of things that they were using. The main two or three were really plague, anthrax, and encephalitis.
Yeah,
So
Colonel Evans' deposition. He
mhm.
says, in the middle of September 1951, we received 2 one-hour lectures from a research analyst of the Research and Development Command in Baltimore, Maryland. Those I remember in simple language were spotted fever, typhus, cholera, malaria, sleeping sickness, and undulant fever.
Yeah, undulant fever.
And then he said both germs and germ-infected insects were being experimented with. 2 types of tanks were being tested, one used as a drop tank and one to contain a germ solution for spraying. There's not a lot about the insect things in here. I struggled for 10 years with Lyme disease. So I'm particularly interested in the
because of course Lyme disease
has wrecked my health. Yeah. Well, a congressman in my state is demanding an investigation as to whether it really was a bioweapon that got loose.
Right.
So, destroyed my health. So I'm particularly bothered by the insect vector and shocked that this went back that far. I just didn't realize it went back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it went back in the United States. I think it's in the new article, but the earliest I saw was like 1947, 1948, where they were saying, yeah, let's do the insect vectors. But they were working with the Unit 731 people, and that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you say plague, do they mention what plague they?
Bubonic plague.
Jesus Christ, excuse me.
Black Death, yes. No, I know, yeah, bubonic plague. And where the Japanese did their research in Pingfan in northern Manchuria, not too far from the Korean border, when the Soviets invaded Manchuria, China, northern China, at the close of World War II, around the time that the A-bombs were dropping. Of course, they fled and they destroyed the research complex they had developed there in Pingfan. And they let loose tons of animals who had been inoculated with plague, and it caused a plague. It caused an epidemic of plague, and to this day, the area still has issues with plague. Right, so an area that supposedly did not really have it as a problem up until that point, at least not at that level. Now, Korea itself didn't even had hundreds of years without cases of plague, and suddenly the cases of plague were popping up. They said, well, they're being brought in by Chinese soldiers from the north. The invaders were bringing in the diseases they came with. But when they looked at the, this is addressed by Joseph Needham in the report by the International Scientific Commission. If that were the case, then you would see, that the plague following the trail of where they came in. You'd have a case of plague here, here, here. But in fact, no, you had, spotted cases here, in random places that seem to follow not where the Chinese armies had gone, but where U.S. planes had dropped, missions, and they laid that out in that report.
In some of the deposition, they talk about how they would do just one spot, then another spot, and it wasn't necessarily along the supply line, although they did some of that too. But like in the early ones, their plans were to do almost random spots.
Right. They wanted they wanted to test out a lot of different delivery devices.
Yeah.
And I think there were a lot of failures, by the way. Nicholson Baker, in his book Baseless, points out how many of you would expect a lot more fatalities, or you would, there should have been more epidemics. But I think one of the reasons we don't see that was, one, the China and North Korea had excellent and very dedicated healthcare services. I mean, they were, they had already, in China, they'd already dealt with Unit 731. They knew what it was. And so they were on the spot. They had, and they were able to mobilize the population in the way that a command government, like a communist government, can. And the people who lived there were very, they believed what their leaders told them, and they were very dedicated, and they went out. In fact, I think one of the links I gave to you was on the anthrax story in China, and there's a sad story in there about some of the more over vociferous. A school teacher in particular, who was so dedicated that she unfortunately didn't take enough precautions and went in and didn't wear the proper protective gear and ended up getting anthrax and dying. But I think that's one reason, but I think another reason was that, they were trying to spread diseases, and sometimes it doesn't work. It's not so, as Ishii himself apparently told someone, it's not so easy, and this may sound very ironic in the context of Lyme disease or COVID-19, but it's not so easy to manufacture an epidemic, at least on command. The ecology, if you will, of epidemics and of bioorganisms is very complex. Why do some areas have greater outbreaks of, say, of COVID-19 versus other areas is still something that, or any illness really, is something that, or cancer clusters, et cetera, is still something that epidemiologists and scientists work to try and understand. It's a very complex interaction between organisms, their environment, and intervening vectors as well.
Yeah, the environment itself just full of all kinds of variables.
Right.
Yeah, on that same note, one of the nicest things in the article, I guess you could say, or things that gave me a little bit relief, also from Colonel Evans' deposition. Let me find it again. General Vandenberg said that he had also been discussing with General Barkas the germ warfare operations of the 5th Air Force, expressing his disappointment with the results thus far being achieved in germ warfare. He said that he wanted good use to be made of night fighter bomber work for germ operations, which, led to, I guess, another level of the way they were doing things. But
right, they moved to night missions.
Yeah. So, but anyway, they were not as successful as they wanted to be, according to this guy. But on the other hand, they bombed the whole place. I mean, they bombed every city in North Korea. So I would imagine that some of the evidence was wiped out, or, it certainly
it's
confused.
A matter of a lot of controversy. Even in the Unit 731 work in China, for decades, they underestimated or underplayed the amount of damage done. In Korea, when the investigators specifically, at least those of the International Scientific Commission, said, we're not going to talk about fatalities. We don't want to give those figures because that would give intelligence information to those conducting the biowarfare about how successful their tactics are. So we don't want them to know. So China and North Korea withheld that information.
Yeah.
And then the Americans weren't going to talk about it either, what they thought. But yes, there was disappointment. And by 1953, or by mid-1953, not too long before the war ended, or at least the battles ended, it was quite clear that they just weren't getting what they wanted. Now, whether that was because it was the Unit 731 style of attack, that's what a lot of people, I think, thought. It wasn't that good. Ishii was known as a salesman, even back in Japan under the Japanese Imperial Army, and some of his stuff didn't work that well. I mean, a lot of these people,
so
they felt that they had oversold.
A snake oil bioweapon salesman?
Yes, that they had oversold was the idea that they were talking, that Ishii oversold it to the Imperial High Command. American bioweapons proponents were overselling it to the Pentagon. And there was, and one thing I'm trying to get is, it turns out that in 1953, the Pentagon had their own agency, the Weapons Systems Evaluation Group, WSEG, and they evaluated weapon systems for the military. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff could decide, what should we implement this weapon system or a group of weapons? And because if you make that decision, a whole lot of things fall from that in terms of allocation of resources, logistics, training, it's a major decision to take on a new weapon system. And then you had, on the other hand, the Research and Development Board. This was had gone back into the 40s, and this was supposedly contained both military and civilian, apparently CIA intelligence individuals who, were trying to fashion an overall policy about what should be researched and developed in the military. And so these two bureaucracies were at odds. There was a study finally done in 1953 about the biological weapons systems. I don't know what was in that report. It's top secret to this day. I'm trying to get it declassified. Who knows how long that will take? But the little bit I was able to read about it is the Research and Development Board was not happy with what the Weapons System Evaluation Group of the Joint Chiefs were saying. They were saying, no, you're not taking this into account. You're not. But what they weren't, the particulars are still secret, classified. I'm suspecting that in this discussion, it may be that finally within the government, some of the weapon systems being considered that were based on the Japanese style of biological warfare were under consideration. And so, yeah, there's still so much we don't know. I'm learning new things about this all the time.
Yeah.
If someone interested in history, it's wide open because everything was shut off for decades. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's do one more question. That will be the bonus question. So basically everything is good now, right? Right, Jeff? We did a biological weapons convention during the Nixon years, and that went through a very various stages, and weapons development is outlawed now. And now we only do biosecurity. So we just do research, including gain of function research, purely in defense, even though this biowarfare machine was rolling pretty fast, it looked like during that time, but somebody just shut that all down, right? Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. And here's another sort of somewhat good note we could leave this on. Maybe you could describe, because you put these things right at the top of the Medium article, the excerpts from the various depositions about what these guys said, about germ warfare and being involved in it and how they felt about it.
Right. Well, the officers, is what we're talking about, supposedly, if we believe what these people are saying, were shocked. They literally were shocked that the U.S. was involved. It was germ warfare raises tons of fears. It doesn't seem like it's very, it's one thing for me to have a gun, I'm shooting at you and you have a gun, and there's some level of skill perhaps, or gamesman, or two planes in the air doing a dogfight. There's something about, that's at least commensurate in terms of the battle, but it's just, there was something to them that felt sneaky, underhanded, really bad.
They said shameful. A lot of them said it was shameful.
But on the other hand, one finding, it's in the Counterpunch article from one of these studies, and never been reported before that I know of publicly, was that when the returning POWs, most of them believed that the United States had engaged in germ warfare. Interesting. And I don't mean the ones who confessed, I mean in general.
Across the board.
These weren't
Wow.
Air Force. In fact, these were mostly Army POWs. They believed that the U.S. had used germ warfare, but they also believed that the U.S. had the right to use germ warfare.
Oh, God.
So, I don't know. It's like how many people today still believe it was okay to drop atomic weapons on Japan?
A lot.
Yeah, well, so I don't want to shoot down the optimism. I think it is important that you bring up that there were many people, and I think to the degree in which we have and know about this biological war campaign today is in part because these guys did speak out, whether, and it's quite obvious that I have some video links in my article, that these men also spoke out, including lower ranking individuals who were pissed off and upset about this. And I think that's one reason they talked. I think there were a few who were coerced to give, you can call it torture, whatever, put in distress positions to become cooperative, quote unquote. But others, I believe, freely gave their information.
Yeah, and, I don't believe that they were not treated poorly as POWs either, across the board. I think that's almost impossible. In any, not because it was any given country either, but
most of them came back in good shape, actually. The whole story of the POWs in Korea War is a very fascinating one, and it's quite dark also because particularly in the early days of the war, there was a lot of death by American POWs sharing, because the North Koreans had no inkling that they were going to be capturing tons of American, and then they were being pursued under air fire, and they were bringing their prisoners along with them, and many died, and they did, they shared, even the prisoners today. You can read read the stories of what prisoners say, and there was some cruelty. There were people who hated us for what we were doing. There were others who, we just shared their fate. They were starving too. We were starving. They were starving. Our captors were starving.
Yeah, it's just wars. There are wars. Horrible things happen in wars. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I would like us to not go to war.
Tell everybody where to find your work, how to follow you, how to keep up with the things you're doing, and all that.
Well, these days I'm publishing still at medium.com, and I have a page there. I think you have a link to my page. And
I do.
Also, I've been publishing on the Korean War as well at Counterpunch. Most of the articles there are free, but this latest one was under Counterpunch Plus, which is their premium site, and it is paywalled. But I will be posting either huge chunks of it or redos of it elsewhere where people can read it. It's only $4 a month. I think, you can cancel after 1 month. So for $4, you can download all my stuff and cancel. I'm not saying it's what you should do, but good.
It's not advising you to do that.
Not advising you at all. I think it's a valuable place, as is your site. And I only getting onto the podcast thing pretty late. I'm an older guy, and it's like, podcast, what is this? And I've done some, but I'm starting to listen and do more. And
you'll get hooked.
Support you and others. Yes, as well.
You get hooked on them. First, you just listen a little bit, and then then you can't do the dishes or rake the leaves without
we're also going to hear things that we don't get to hear in the mainstream media, for sure.
That is the sad thing, right? On the other hand, it's, I don't know. It makes works for podcasters, though, but I'd rather have it in the mainstream.
Yeah, I don't want to put you out of work either.
Well, I could find something else to do. Get this stuff in the mainstream.
Okay.
Thanks so much. It was great to talk to you again, and I really appreciate all the time you've taken. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me here and letting me talk about this important
and your invaluable work. How can anybody thank you for that?
Well, they can't just say thank you. I'll say you're welcome.
I'll say thank you, but that we should have prizes for these kind of things or whatever. I don't know. I guess we don't really care about prizes so much as we do, having this kind of thing change and the information be more widespread and all that.
Right.
All right. Take care, Jeff.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay. We'll be talking to you again.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Jeffrey Kaye. Follow him on Twitter at Jeff_K and find his work at Medium. You can find all the links in these show notes. This is a fully independent podcast. In this age of censorship, seriously, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can get access to bonus content and support the show. Also, it helps to like, share, and subscribe, and leave some reviews. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram at t.me/aroundtheempire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody. Stay strong.